Hi everybody, my name is Ali. I'll be giving a talk about our paper where we talk about different game attributes we research and their effect on motivation. Is this, can you hear me back there or? Okay. So our bigger scope of research is educational games. And like every good scholar, when we want to start, we start with Google. So we researched educational games on Google, and this is kind of a sample of what we saw. This game is an educational game that teaches basic mathematics skills for kids, where based on the different mathematical operations you do, you can shoot down asteroid-like, lunch boxes and pizza slices. This other game we found is like Snoot. I don't know if anybody played the game Snoot, but with letters. And then this other game is called the Plural Girls, which teaches different ways to find plurals for English nouns. And then finally this game is called the Grammar Gorillas. It's about finding different grammatical structures in the English language. Now the one thing that I can look at when I see this is I remember a phrase that was thrown around the last session at 10 o'clock. Chocolate-covered broccoli. Because, looking at this, if this is the best we can do as far as educational games, it's, we're not doing a good enough job. Now, I've seen a bunch of educational games out there that actually are successful and are done in a much better way, but not enough. So what's the problem? When we're looking at educational games, there are really two types of serious games out there. There is the exogenous type, where you take the learning content and you just layer it on top of the existing game content. You know that it's easier to build and modify. You can take the, looking at the games we just talked about, you can take the learning content and put a different type, history or math or whatever question you want to ask them, to have them shoot down the asteroid or have them play Snoot. That's an exogenous type. It's very easy to build. But the problem with it is, it's pretty much glorified PowerPoint presentations. They don't take that essential aspect of games that we love, the motivation that we have to play games. And then there's the other type, endogenous types, where the game has an embedded learning content within the fantasy or the game mechanics itself. That's the type we all strive at. The good thing about that type is it harnesses the inherent motivation in video games. But the problem with that is very difficult to build. And the other problem with it is we don't really understand how we build one. I mean, I haven't really seen one out there that seamlessly integrates the learning content to the game mechanics enough that people want to play it because it's fun, not because they have to. So the issue in building one of those that we can see is motivation. How do we harness the motivation of video games into serious games? To understand motivation, there are two types of motivation. There is the extrinsic motivation, which is based on reward punishment. We've heard a lot of this in the last 3 days of GLS. You do things because you have to. You do things based on, to get a reward or not to get punished. And then there is the, other type of motivation, like intrinsic motivation, which is doing things because we want to. Play video games, play sports. And that's the eternal question of how to get kids to stop playing video games and study and learn. But what we've kind of heard the last couple of days is these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We can have them to do both at the same time. They can learn through playing video games. So before we put our research together, we looked at different studies out there that talk about motivation, talk about games and the player's perception in those games. The first one that deals with motivation in video games, and it's kind of the holy grail of motivation in video games. It's Malone 1980, Malone Lepper 1987. They talk about intrinsic fantasy, extrinsic fantasy, their effect on motivation. Another one we looked at is at DC and Ryan 2000, where they talk about the factors that affect intrinsic motivation. And then we looked at the happy dissertation. That was very interesting because he built his own video game, educational game, and he built two versions, an endogenous version and an exogenous version, and kind of tested motivation and learning between those two versions. And then there's a Dean and Shaw in 2010. They asserted that when we look at video games, educational games, we try to hide the learning content so the player doesn't get bored. They want to play the game because it's fun. If we hide it well enough, it might be hidden from the player and ultimately not having learned the content. So we need to put it not within the fantasy element but within the game mechanics. So they have to go across it to finish the game. And they call it identify regulations. And then finally the Garris paper of 2002, where they look at different game attributes from different studies in the past and how they affect motivation, and they sum it up in this one large, nice and neatly piled data. So to study motivation, we need to know what affects motivation. We really can boil down to two things. We have the player and the game. The player is, you look at the game experience, looking at age, demographics, gender, genre preference, game preference, and all those change the motivation type. So it will be really hard to kind of study all that and put all that into one night, pile. So what we looked at is we looked at the game, and to look at the game, we have to break it down by the game attributes. So we used that Garris paper we mentioned earlier to kind of break down games into 6 different attributes. The first one we came up with is fantasy, which is the context, the theme, the story, the characters, and then there was the rules and the goals, sensory stimuli, challenge, level of difficulty, mystery. We define mystery as determinism because it basically sums up how much you know about your progress so far and how much you know about what to expect based on what you do. And then finally, the player's control. So those are the 6 attributes that we put together that, in our eyes, define what a game is. So how much of each of these attributes affects motivation? That's the first question we asked in the study, is how can we find out each of these attributes' own unique effect on motivation? To do that, we have 2 different choices. We can either empirically figure it out, which we don't understand how to even break it down, so it will be very difficult to do. Also, the player's perception changes from game to game and from player to player, so we can't really do that. So the other option we have to do is ask players about their experiences and use their perception as a guideline. So the first study that we did, the goal was break down the game attributes that we just mentioned into measurable descriptions that we can actually put in some sort of metric. And to do that, for challenge, we define it as a difficulty level of the game, ranging from too easy to difficult. Control is how much control does a player perceive they have in a game by choices between directions and objectives. And then goals as short and long-term goals. Now you notice we skipped 3 attributes. That was on purpose because we wanted to limit the scope for the first study in order to see what kind of data we're going to get and what kind of trends we'll see, and if this is even a valid way of researching this. So we limited to these 3 attributes. So first we had to produce the questions that we will ask the subjects to find out the measurable data for these attributes. So for challenge, the question we came up with is, in an optimal game, how many tries does it take to finish an average level? For control, we asked them about the ideal number of directions and then also the ideal number of objectives they get. And then for goals, we asked them about short-term goals and long-term goals. So these are the 5 questions that we came up with for those 3 attributes. Now again, we do understand this is for the player's perception only. We don't expect to get the actual results, we just get what they perceive as the values. So look at the respondents. We sent it out to 6 mailing lists of game enthusiasts like Digra, Game Network, DePaul Game Dev, and etc. And we received 87 responses. 94% of the survey takers play video games at least 3 hours a week. So we were getting some experienced video gamers or frequent video gamers. And 100% of them say they play video games in the last 5 years, at least for the last 5 years. 68% said they had at least a bachelor's degree, 100% finished high school, so we're looking at more of an adult level of gamers, and 72% were male. And 87% were the age of 18 to 40. That's just kind of trends. The other trends that we found is we put the results in a model where we try to grab 3 to 4 range values that gets us the most percentage of respondents. And as you can see, for challenge, 2 to 5, 86% said that it should take 2 to 5 tries per level for an average game. For control, for objectives, was 74% said 3 to 5, 82% said 2 to 5 for directions, and that was the initial model they came up with, called it a generic control challenge and goals framework. It was a great first step, but the problem with it is we don't really ask the different perception between genres, which we know varies greatly. So we started with a second study that differentiates between the different genres. So the goal of this study was to first define 5 unique genres. Now, there are many genres out there, but we wanted 5 kind of universal, non-overlapping genres, because if you pick action and action-adventure and first-person shooter, there's a lot of games that would cross between those 3 genres. So we wanted to pick 5 that are kind of unique. They don't really represent every genre out there, but they will kind of limit the scope of what we're trying to figure out. So we got first-person shooter, racing, RPG, arcade, and sports. Those are the 5 genres we started with. And for the survey questions, we just mapped the questions from the first survey to the second survey based on the genre. So for example, for a racing game, we don't use the word level, we use a race. And for an RPG, we talk about a solo boss fight. Or for a sports game, we say a match or a game, depending on what the game is. And we used the same mailing list, received 77 responses. Results were very similar. 89% were college degree, 75% were male, and 98% played at least 3 hours a week. And this is the result we received. We used the same way we displayed the first model into the second model, but we broke it down by genre. So if you look at the first cell, for the first-person shooter game, 80% said it takes 2 to 5 attempts per level, and then you go to racing, it's 2 to 5 to place the top 3 in a racing game, RPG 1 to 5, and so on and so forth. So this study addresses what first study didn't, which is the differences between the different genres and the player's perception between the genres. But we haven't really accounted for the 3 other attributes, like fantasy, sensory stimuli, and mystery, which we actually do in the current study we're doing right now. We'll talk about in a second. We didn't consider interpersonal attributes, like cooperation, competition, collaboration. I mean, these things with today's online gameplay are more relevant than ever. And we didn't look at the other genres like action, adventure, simulations, and so on and so forth. So those things we recommend for future work. As far as what we're working on right now, we have a current study that validates this framework, but what it does is brings subjects into the lab. We chosen 10 games, 2 per genre, and we had them play the games with pre-survey, post-survey, and then we asked them questions during the gameplay itself. Certain intervals, we broke it down, and then we asked about the different attributes. This gave us a chance to first standardize the games, so not everybody's answering based on their own games that they played, and also bring in game experts where they go through these game intervals and define and give us their opinion on what those attributes are measured at those intervals. Another thing we're working on is we're testing the impact of challenge on motivation in commercial games. So we took Super Mario Brothers and we went through an emulator and changed the challenge up, created 5 different versions with the base, easy, hard, harder, and easier, where we introduce more obstacles, more enemies, and then reduce the obstacles versus enemies, and we're trying to find the level of motivation by the changing of difficulty. That's still ongoing. And another one that's still ongoing is the similar thing. We do it with a serious game called Policy World, courtesy of Matt Easterly over in Northwestern. It's a serious game where they teach different ways to debate policy. And he gave us access to the authoring tools, so we're going to change up the authoring tools and test the motivation based on the different difficulty levels of the game, and also provides us with an extra parameter, which is learning, and test the learning based on the different difficulty levels of the game. And if you have any questions, I don't know if we're doing all 3 afterwards or.
Run through all 3.
Okay. This is our wiki where we have all the studies and summaries and everything that's going on, and it's also my email if you have any questions. Gladly share it with you.